Very latest in the last few minutes from Downing Street doesn't really add much to what you were just saying. As you said, the Prime Minister remains in an intensive care unit for close monitoring. He is in good spirits, it says. I think the fact that he isn't actually on a ventilator machine, even though he was zipped into the intensive care unit last night, gives some people hope that his condition is maybe not as bad as that rush to the intensive care unit might have made people think. But there has been a kind of pattern over the last couple of weeks that the actual hard news when you hear it about Boris Johnson's health is sometimes a bit worse than the briefing beforehand. Downing Street, though, saying they are being absolutely candid about his condition. He has not been on a ventilator, and so some people will take at least a bit of hope from that about his condition. The other stuff that's coming out of Whitehall and Number 10 today is the emphasis that they are getting on with business. Boris Johnson nominated Dominic Raab. It was communicated to him that he, the Foreign Secretary, would be standing in for the Prime Minister as necessary. And that caveat there also a bit of a clue to just how we do not live in a presidential system. Dominic Raab is not a vice president who takes on all the powers or anything of the sort. And some cabinet ministers are already signalling, your writ does not run. You will have to get agreement with us if there is a major decision to be made and there is disagreement. The next big decision on the agenda is the 3-week review of the clampdown that Boris Johnson instituted just over 2 weeks ago. So that comes next week. I think we can be pretty clear there is unanimity around the cabinet table that now is not the time to relax the restrictions that Boris Johnson imposed, but there could be many other decisions to come. But that one, I think we can be absolutely clear on. The clampdown that Boris Johnson instituted just over 2 weeks ago is going to be extended. Only 10 minutes walk from Downing Street. The Prime Minister is facing a third night in St Thomas's Hospital, a second night in the intensive care unit. Number 10 said he was in a stable condition and was not having to use a ventilator machine. He had not, they said, been diagnosed with pneumonia, as some suspected. Last night, the Prime Minister communicated to the Foreign Secretary that he wanted him to deputise for him. And Dominic Raab was chairing the COVID coordinating meeting this morning.
In line with the Prime Minister's instructions, this morning I chaired the meeting of senior ministers tackling coronavirus, and this afternoon I chaired an update for members of the Cabinet. I think it's probably worth just remembering that, as will be the case for many people up and down the country who know someone at work who's fallen ill with the coronavirus, it comes as a shock to all of us. He's not just the Prime Minister. For all of us in Cabinet, he's not just our boss. He's also a colleague, and he's also our friend. So all of our thoughts and prayers are with the Prime Minister at this time, with Carrie and with his whole family. And I'm confident he'll pull through. Because if there's one thing I know about this Prime Minister, he's a fighter. And he'll be back at the helm, leading us through this crisis in short order.
Outside St Thomas's Hospital, international media. There were best wishes from world leaders flooding in. Buckingham Palace tweeted that the Queen had sent a message to the Prime Minister's fiancé and to his family, telling them they were in her thoughts for a full and speedy recovery. The government was repeatedly asked who was actually in charge now. If there was cabinet disagreement, would Dominic Raab call the shots?
But the arrangements are very clear. The Prime Minister has asked for me to deputise for him in discharging the responsibilities for as long as he's unable to do that. And we have got, in the discharge of those responsibilities and, frankly, the direction, the instructions he's given, very clear plans. So we're all focused with a unity of purpose and a clear and calm determination to get that done.
Flowers from the Pakistan High Commission. One cabinet minister was asked who would make the decision due next week on whether the shutdown would be continued after 3 weeks in operation.
It won't be delayed. It will be the case that we will take that decision collectively as a cabinet. The person who will chair that cabinet, the person who will make the final decision, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, the Foreign Secretary.
Whitehall sources said Dominic Raab, as temporary stand-in, might struggle to rule one way or another on cabinet divisions. Some think he would not necessarily get the job if the Prime Minister could not carry on.
If Boris Johnson were permanently unable to do the job, or at least were thought to be unable to do the job for months rather than, say, weeks, I think the Cabinet would then have to come to a decision as to who would take over as interim or acting Prime Minister at that point. Now, that could mean, in the long term, even an election for the leadership of the Conservative Party. I don't think, however, we're talking about that. What we're talking about is the Cabinet coming to a decision as to who is best placed to actually take up the role of Prime Minister.
It wouldn't necessarily be Dominic Raab.
No, I'm not sure that Dominic Raab would be the first pick of those around the Cabinet table.
Well, the government business, I'm sure, will proceed properly. I was in touch with the Foreign Secretary last night. We will do our bit. The Labour Party will act in the national interest and be constructive in this, because I know how anxious people are, and we've got to get through this and defeat this virus.
Manchester, the setting for Boris Johnson's first conference as leader. This hall now being converted into NHS Nightingale Hospital Northwest, with 750 beds. 200 miles south, the Prime Minister is spending his second night in an intensive care ward as his fiancée, his family and the nation waits.
Well, we hope to be joined in a moment, if internet permitting, by the Conservative MP Danny Kruger, who used to work for Boris Johnson in Downing Street. But we are now joined by Alistair Campbell, who, of course, worked in Downing Street for many years for Tony Blair. It is a difficult place, clearly, for government ministers and advisers to actually maintain the kind of distancing that we're all trying to maintain.
Yeah, I suspect it has been fairly lax in there, but I think that now that we're, as it were, right into the crisis in the way that we are, I suspect they are. And of course, quite a lot of them are off self-isolating even before this. But I think in an odd sort of way, the clarity that now exists around the fact that Boris Johnson is clearly quite seriously ill and in intensive care, I think in an odd sort of way allows the government now, one, I think, to get more understanding from the public. I don't think anybody in the world now can say, oh, I didn't really realise this was going to be very serious. I think when your Prime Minister goes down with it, that's a pretty powerful message in itself. And the second thing is I think the public and the opposition and the media will be reasonable and if you like, give the government, those ministers and civil servants who now have to step up and assume the additional responsibility, they'll give them a bit of slack.
Danny Kruger, let me bring you in. Thanks for joining us. We saw Dominic Raab leading the press conference this evening. How reassured do you feel that he is able to project and the government is able to project an air of getting on with the important business of running the country during this crisis while the Prime Minister is in hospital?
Well, I hope they can project that air, because that's exactly what seems to be happening. I'm very impressed by not just today and yesterday, but over the course of this crisis, how united the government has been. We do genuinely have collective cabinet government in this country and at this time, and you have a bunch of senior ministers there who've been working together very effectively over recent weeks and months. And so far, from what we've heard from Dominic Raab today, that is clearly continuing.
When you look at all the people who got it, and this came up in the press conference, actually, the Health Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Chief Medical Officer, do you think this could actually have also an impact on policy and the way the government approaches the lockdown and any question of when to start relaxing it? Because, it's clearly a much more serious situation than when we first started talking to the public about this, and Boris Johnson was talking about shaking the hands of people with coronavirus and not needing to close big national events, right at the beginning of this, before everything was absolutely clear. So do you think this could actually have an effect on the way Britain moves forward?
Well, no is the answer. I don't think that the fact that the Prime Minister has caught the virus changes policy. And as we've seen, we have an effective system of government, and the machine behind the politicians is working very smoothly and very well. They're all working at great pace, and it's no doubt extremely stressful. But they seem to be, and from the contacts I've been having with them, the system is working. So I don't think they'll be thinking that we should change policy now. As we've heard, encouraging signs in recent days about the rate of the infection possibly beginning to plateau, but we need more time to ensure that happens and to see that feed through into the actual rate of death. And it's only after that that we can start talking about potentially relaxing the restrictions.
Alistair Campbell, what would you say about that? And also what we were just talking about in terms of the true numbers of people who are dying clearly being much higher than the number being announced every night as having died in hospital by the Department of Health, not because of any desire to mislead, but just because of the way the numbers are being collated.
Yeah, look, I think the public understand that an awful lot of people are ill and far too many people have died. And I think the other point I'd make about Boris Johnson being in hospital, and look, he's the Prime Minister, he's the leader of the government at a time of national crisis. There's rightly massive focus on his health. But I think there's a real risk for the government in this. The government, in a sense, has to park the fact that Boris Johnson is there, because they must not now be distracted, particularly as these ministers do have additional responsibilities now. They mustn't be distracted from focusing on the task in hand. And I also think it's important that, yes, let's rightly discuss one person, but there are thousands of people in hospital. There are millions of people anxious. And the government really must focus on all of them, and indeed all of the challenges that were still there, that were there when Boris Johnson was in Downing Street, and they're still there now, whether that's ventilators or testing or general issues of capacity. So I think it's really important that the government does not get distracted by this, very hard though that is.
Danny Kruger, is there also a lesson for other ministers and officials who have this, that sort of trying to carry on with your job when you are fighting a serious illness is perhaps not the best thing to do?
Well, that's something that the medical professionals will need to advise us on, is to what extent you should be soldiering on when you begin to go down with the virus. We understand that the Prime Minister was on a reduced workload last week when he was self-isolating. That clearly wasn't enough to help him recover. So it might be something to think about. But I'm afraid, you're not going to get officials and senior ministers slackening off at a time like this. They're all going to be working incredibly hard, and that's the right thing to do. The important thing is that we have systems that work. We have a sister cabinet committee structure which was put in place in recent weeks, partly in order to ensure that if any particular ministers were out of action for a little while because of the virus, the system could carry on. We have a very large civil service. We have a system of advisors. And we have, but the other thing to mention is, we all talk a lot about national policy. Really, this battle is being fought at a local level. It's what's happening in the local NHS, in local authorities, and right down to villages and towns supporting isolated people. We have an infrastructure in this country which is doing its job. And Alistair's right. We can't, for all our personal sympathy for the Prime Minister and the fact that he represents our nation at this time, he's our leader. He's not going to decide whether we get out of this or not, or when. It's going to be the whole system that needs to work properly.